Now, Britain's economy, in case you haven't noticed, is in the toilet. Growth has collapsed. Productivity is poor. Living standards have suffered one of the sharpest declines on recent record. Confidence has slumped and prosperity feels like a distant dream. I don't know about you, but when I walk around the streets of Britain these days, I feel a mix of depression and embarrassment. The streets are dirty, public transport rarely works, and when it does arrive, it's worn down. Petty crime has basically been legalised, leaving a mood of fear and anxiety hanging in the air. Public services are a joke. London is dead. People are visibly struggling and nothing seems to work. The only thing I do feel certain about is that while the present is already worse than the past, the future looks set to be even worse. Now, today, Labour Chancellor Rachel Reeves issued her emergency budget, a panic move because she was on the brink of breaking her own fiscal rules. And while she's facing criticism for cutting public services and losing control of the public finances, there is a much bigger picture being missed here. We have 170,000 more civil servants on the payroll than we did in 2016, all of whom, by the way, are being paid for by you, the British taxpayer. Our welfare spending has been going up and is now projected to surpass £360 billion a year by 2028-29. Our debt servicing costs are over £100 billion. That's the cost of servicing our national credit card. It's our fourth highest cost. Bear in mind that we are borrowing as well more than £100 billion every year too, leaving our economy in a deeply vulnerable, fragile place. Our productivity is basically non-existent. And on top of all that, we're now flooding the economy with masses of low-skill, low-wage migration from outside of Europe, migrants who are taking more out of the economy than they're putting in, as even the Office for Budget Responsibility now accepts. The verdict, I think, is clear. We are facing a severe economic crisis. New YouGov polling shows that just 16% of the British public think that the government is handling the economy well, and only 11% think Rachel Reeves is doing a good job. I know, I'm wondering about the 11% as well. Pollsters Ipsos Murray find that only 14% of people out there in the country feel better off under the Labour government. Only 14%, a shocking number. And you know what? With today's news that the OBR, a deeply flawed institution in itself, has halved growth forecasts for the year from 2 to 1%, it proves that the British people are right to feel this way. But let's be honest, this isn't just about dissatisfaction with the Labour government. This is about dissatisfaction with the entire political class. Hardly anybody out there thinks that Labour has the answers, and they certainly don't think that the Tories have the answers either. When I look out there at the country, I see a collapse of public trust and faith in the entire establishment, which looks completely out of touch with the concerns of ordinary people. An establishment that, whether on the left or the right, whether Labour or the Tories, is wedded to this big tax, big spending, big welfare, big state, big net zero, big immigration economy that's making us poorer and pushing us into managed decline. And this isn't just about the economy either. When people are asked who will lower immigration, who will stop the small boats, who will reduce crime, the most popular answer today is not Labour, it's not the Conservatives, it's none of them. There is a widespread feeling among the British people that they are now trapped in a flimsy, disintegrating boat on stormy seas with no captain and surrounded by enormous, terrifying waves. It's a sense that nobody in power really knows what they're doing anymore, that nobody is even bothering to listen to the forgotten majority. The country, I think, needs a radical overhaul of public spending, government efficiency, tax cuts and deregulation. We need to get back to what really matters when it comes to driving prosperity. But none of the Westminster class is willing to give Britain the economic electric shock therapy that we desperately need. As ever, let me know your views at gbnews.com/yoursay or hit me up at X at GoodwinMJ. I'm joined now, though, by one of the godfathers of Euroscepticism and monetarist economics, Patrick Minford. Patrick, thank you for joining us on the show. It is a big day in British politics. We've got that spring statement from Rachel Reeves. Can we just get your initial reaction to what you heard today from the Chancellor at just after midday?
Well, it's welcome that she is going to try to cut public spending and the civil service and also the welfare bill. That is welcome news. The trouble is she's put the economy in a terrible position with her last budget, with this big rise in taxes, particularly on low-paid workers. the national insurance tax that she's put on is very damaging to business and very, very damaging to employment. And on top of that, and far worse, really, she put these big inheritance tax and capital gains tax changes, which have hammered business confidence and really upset the small business sector and farms, which have been hugely set back. And it's very bad for business confidence what she did in her last budget. So really, she's trying to make good after that terrible mistake, and that's all very difficult to do. And then you can add in the employment bill, which is about to become law, which is very, very damaging again to small businesses. And at the bottom of what you say is the productivity disaster, because how can you get productivity up when business is being whacked by these very demanding, killing taxes on, their activities and their prospects? That's where she's. But I do welcome the fact that she's trying to cut the size of public spending and also cut the welfare bill. I mean, that is a step forward at least.
But Patrick, it does seem that we're not really dealing with the underlying structural problems in our national economy. And it seems to me, at least, that as we head into the next budget in the autumn, it's almost certain that we're going to have some kind of tax rises or even more sweeping spending cuts just to deal with the underlying structural problems in the economy. We've got too much debt. We've got very expensive debt. We've got still very low growth rates historically. We've got low productivity. I think we've got too much immigration that is encouraging businesses to avoid innovating, to avoid becoming more dynamic. It seems that Labour and Rachel Reeves are sort of kicking the bigger problems into the long grass.
Well, yes, I agree with you. The whole direction is wrong, because what they've done is to kill growth with their last sets of measures. And what they need to do is to reorientate the economy towards growth by rewarding business investment and innovation. That's at the root of it all. Really, the whole of the orientation of policy has been wrong. They've raised taxes and killed off the incentives of business, and then said they want growth and they want to kind of make everything fit that. But of course, they haven't got any growth because they've kicked away the support of growth in the form of incentives for business to innovate. So the beginning of it all, they have to reconstruct the whole thing so that there's an incentive to grow for business. The beginning of everything is incentives for business in the private sector, and then keeping the government under some sort of limit so that then there's money to pay for public services, helped by the growth that the private sector can make available. But
Patrick Minford, can I just show you a clip briefly of Kemi Badenoch, the leader of the Conservative Party, reacting to the spring statement? Let me just show you this clip for a minute.
I think that it was all smoke and mirrors. I remember the last budget when Rachel Reeves said she was smashing glass ceilings. Now it feels like the roof is falling over all our heads. Inflation is up 2.6% to 3.2%. Unemployment is going up, and it's forecast to go higher year after year after year. There's people's jobs out there. That's terrible. And growth has halved. Even the forecasts which he said were promising are lower than what they were last year. Something has to change. This is chaos.
So, Patrick Minford, briefly, if I may, what do you make of Kemi Badenoch's reaction there to the spring statement?
Well, I think she's right that the policy is going nowhere, and it needs to be turned around 180 degrees to focus on growth. Everybody's been very, very sort of sneering about Liz Truss, but she got the priorities right. She tried to create an environment in which growth was the prime aim, and there were incentives for business to create it with low taxes and, without this sort of crazy approach that this government has, which is the private sector doesn't matter. What matters is unions and the public sector, and we'll raise taxes to pay for them. That isn't the right way to go. They shouldn't have raised taxes on business. They should have kept taxes down. And we need
Absolutely.
to get back to the philosophy of putting business first. And then, I'm hoping Kemi Badenoch will move in that direction and point the way to these new policies that are needed to put growth at the heart of the mission and make everything else fit with that.
Well, thank you, Patrick Minford. Now, with me is my panel, former Labour Party advisor Matthew Laza and former Reform UK spokesman Gawain Towler. Matthew, Patrick Minford there saying basically Labour doesn't really understand the incentives that drive business prosperity and growth, and that they are really out of step with what it means to have a growing economy.
Well, I completely disagree. I mean, this government's entire agenda is about growth. I mean, one of the reasons that, yes, growth is forecast to be lower this year, but it's forecast to be higher later in the Parliament. One of the reasons for that is that at long last, the planning system is being unlocked so that we can get building.
0.2%.
Yeah, well, I mean, it also means that the 170,000 extra houses that wouldn't otherwise be built will be built because of those planning regulations. I mean, that's actually what Liz Truss talked about and couldn't deliver. So, I mean, there's no... The logic of this argument just ridiculous. Patrick's saying, Liz Truss was doing the right things to unleash the economy. One of them, as she talked about, was planning reform. Neither she, in her very brief premiership, nor the other, however many it was, Conservative Prime Ministers, delivered reform of the planning system. Labour's delivered it in 6 months. So let's see what it delivers over the long term. But it's all very well for right-wing commentators to say, you should do this, you should do that, and then when Labour does it, it's ignored, which I think is a very strange argument.
Now, we heard a lot today from Rachel Reeves about how this is all the result of global factors, Donald Trump and, Ukraine and so on. But the reality is it was Rachel Reeves at the last budget who increased taxes on businesses through national insurance. It was Labour that went on a big spending spree. A lot of this that we're seeing reflected in the growth figures, that we're seeing reflected in this deteriorating economy, I would argue, should land on Rachel Reeves' shoulders. She's kicking a lot of the longer-term stuff into the long grass, right? She's not really dealing with what's the strategy for cutting debt? What's the strategy for getting back to good growth rates? What's the strategy for actually driving productivity in the British economy again?
Well, I don't agree with that at all, because one of the big things that she's getting a lot of flack for from the left is the firmness on welfare, which includes a huge mission to get people off welfare and into work, which is what you have to do by expanding the size of the workforce. She had to increase taxes in the last budget, not least because as well as sorting out the frankly selection of unfunded spending commitments that the Tories left. She also invested in the NHS. You call it a spending spree. If you're going to have one of the 7 million people on the waiting list and it delivers the operation that you've been waiting for years, you're going to say thank you very much for it.
Yeah, and by raising taxes, she also broke one of Labour's manifesto pledges. Gawain, I mean, what's your reaction to the spring statement today and what you heard from the Chancellor?
I think it's the whole growth agenda that Labour has trumpeted is a chimera. The Labour economic approach, both the budget and the spring statement, have been intensely political rather than economic. They are playing to a political audience rather than the audience that they need to play to, which is the people who employ people. Having an employment rights bill, which isn't even covered in the OBR, having an employment rights bill that will make it harder to employ people, it's all very well saying people have rights, but the first right they need is having a job. And the problem is we've had 230,000 businesses close since the budget. That's before the budgetary impact that comes in April. And I think there's a cut of from 2% to 1% growth. And yet somehow, in some bizarre way next year, because as the planning conditions have been improved, which won't kick in instantly anyhow, that they will double it. I don't believe that. And it is also interesting that, of course, all the way through the Tory period, when the Tories pointed to the global situation, no, it's entirely your fault. As soon as Labour's in, it's the global situation. Look, squirrels over there, squirrels over there. I mean, it's dishonest.
Matthew, Gawain does have a point. We have 200,000 businesses closing. We have millionaires leaving at a record rate, especially when compared to other countries. I mean, let's just be frank. Business isn't feeling much confidence in the British economy at the moment. And I think a lot of people are looking at Britain and thinking, is this a place I want to invest? A lot of young people thinking, should I actually move to Dubai or take up digital nomad visas
I'm not sure that many people are thinking they should move to Dubai. I think a few writers for certain newspapers who've got access to that.
Let's just be real with one another for a moment. The economy, it's not going well for the vast majority of people who are watching this show. Now, when are we actually going to deal with these underlying structural problems?
Well, that's what I mean. Now is the answer to that, and that's why Welfare to Work, which is one of the key platforms of Labour's approach. Because I agree with you. Some of those businesses that complain are also businesses that got used to the sugar rush of very cheap labour from outside the EU. I mean, one of the interesting things about the graphics and the figures that you use, we've had 160,000 extra civil servants since 2016. Guess what happened then? Brexit. We've had
Sure.
You've also had the issue about immigration, where immigrants from the EU were net contributors to the economy because of mass immigration from outside the EU. Overall, the average was positive. Now the average is negative since we left, and we don't have the access to the labour pool. So self-inflicted wounds inflicted by the Brexiteers.
The number of people who stayed, 6 million people who took permanent residence? I think that covers for our European friends arriving here, frankly. But what we've had since then, the Boris wave and all the rest of it, we know that the vast, vast majority of recent migrants are a drain on the economy and will be a continued drain for decades.
Can I just ask you one thing? I saw that the former Prime Minister Liz Truss put a video out today basically saying, look, what you've heard today is the accumulation of things that I warned about when I was in office. Spiralling debts, a big state, not
all this is
net
true.
Zero, the fiscal costs, etc. Now, Liz Truss basically saying what we need in this country is a shock to the economic settlement that the Treasury and SW1 are not really capable of entertaining.
Yes, Truss clearly was a woman in a hurry. She realised that she only had 2 years to change things and tried to do it all at once. She front-loaded everything in one go, and that fell apart. If you look at what Thatcher did, she built for years to get in a position to do that emergency surgery. But she spent a long time building up stocks, building up supplies so she could do the emergency surgery. And that's not something Truss has done, and it's certainly not something this government's done.
And just briefly, Matthew Larsett, there are Labour MPs who are absolutely furious about what they've heard today, the welfare cuts in particular, the cuts to foreign aid. How is this spring statement going to sit within the Labour Party?
Well, I think there are going to be quite a lot of unhappy people about the welfare cuts. It will be fine to get it through Parliament, but because of the size of the majority. But when people talk about shock and awe to the economy, what that shock and awe to the economy means, this tiny thing of freezing, which is obviously has individual impact, but of freezing some benefit levels. If you really want to cut billions out of the economy, you're talking about taking money out of vulnerable people's pockets, and you're talking about taking money out of the NHS, education, and now defence. It's easy sound bites, and I would play that same argument to people on the Labour left, equally on the populist right.
Well, thank you to my panel for now.